calling Kentucky can a single county claim the center of the global bourbon industry, a monastery of silent monks, and a pioneer town originally named for the blood sport of ripping the head off of a greased goose. Hi, I'm Michael, and I'm learning a little bit more about Kentucky. One county at a time. All 120 of them. And today, I'm learning about Nelson County. Nelson straddles two distinct regions. The Outer Bluegrass region dominates the east, while the Knobs region pushes into the west. Today, the population sits around 47,000. But human history in this area stretches back over 11,000 years. Archaeologists excavating a site called Withrow Creek discovered the remains of a campsite dating back to the year 400. They unearthed storage pits containing sections of jars. The residents used these vessels to cook and store food, indicating a shift towards more permanent settlement. By the time European explorers arrived, permanent indigenous towns, though, had vanished from the area. The end of the Revolutionary War triggered a rush of settlers over the Appalachian Mountains. The Virginia legislature officially formed Nelson County in 1784, naming the territory to honor Thomas Nelson, Jr., a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Pioneer Isaac Cox established a fortified station along the creek in 1775. Settlers constructed these stations by building cabins in a square and surrounding them with stockade fences to defend against indigenous raids. For example, Benjamin Polk built a settlement along Simpsons Creek, but over time, warriors attacked the outpost and burned it to the ground. A man named David Bard secured a land grant for 1,000 acres in the center of the county. William Bard arrived to survey the property and plot a town there. A group of pioneers settled the tract in 1780 and originally named the community Salem. However, residents eventually chartered the settlement as Bairdstown in 1788 to honor the brothers who managed the land. The spelling shifted on documents over the decades, transitioning from Bairdstown to Beardstown before eventually settling on Bardstown. Other communities formed around the county. A settlement grew along the east fork of Simpson Creek. The residents on the east bank called their side Middlesburg. The residents on the west bank called their side Gandertown. They chose the name Gandertown to honor a frontier blood sport called gander pulling. This is rough. Participants would grease the neck of a live goose, hang the bird from a tree branch, and attempt to pull its head off while riding past on horseback. A doctor named John Bemis eventually bought land in the area, laid out a grid of streets, and renamed the unified town. The new name was Bloomfield to distance the community from the sport. A settlement called Turkeytown changed its name to Fairfield. And then residents of a town called Bealsboro realized their homes sat in a floodplain. They dismantled their community and moved to higher ground to reach the advancing railroad line, establishing the town of Boston. While frontiersmen laid out towns, a different demographic arrived to build churches. British warships had devastated the economy of the Chesapeake Bay area during the Revolution, so dozens of Catholic families fled to Maryland to seek economic survival in the West. Basil Hayden led flatboats down the Ohio River with them in 1785, and then the families marched inland and claimed land along Pottinger's Creek. I've mentioned him before, but Reverend William de Rohan arrived a few years later and oversaw the construction of Holy Cross in 1792. It stood as the first Catholic church erected west of the Allegheny Mountains. If this sounds familiar, it's because I've talked about it before. But because county lines shifted constantly during this era of rapid expansion, the physical church actually sits in neighboring Marion County today, but its establishment fundamentally shaped Nelson County's foundation. Pope Pius VII recognized the devotion of the pioneers and established the Diocese of Bardstown in 1808. He created the diocese on the exact same day he created the Diocese of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. The Bardstown Diocese encompassed an immense territory stretching from the Great Lakes down to the Deep South. The frontier was harsh, and the growing Catholic community desperately needed infrastructure. In 1812, Bishop John Baptist Mary David called for young women willing to devote their lives to the service of the church. 19-year-old Catherine Spalding answered the call, founding the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth. The sisters became the backbone of the region's social safety net. They nursed victims of a horrific 1833 cholera epidemic, took in orphans, and built schools, expanding from a single log cabin into an international congregation that continues to operate worldwide today. Trappist monks eventually arrived in the county. Fleeing the upheaval of Napoleon's France, they established the Abbey of Our Lady of Gethsemane. The monks took vows of silence, worked the land, and built an institution that continues to operate today. But some would argue that the Abbey became an international institution because of a writer. In 1941, a young intellectual spiritualist named Thomas Merton arrived at the gates. He became a monk and wrote books like The Seven-Story Mountain, which became international bestsellers and turned the quiet Kentucky Abbey into a center for spiritual thought. Merton passed away in 1968, but his impact remained. Later on, the monastery hosted an unprecedented interreligious dialogue between Buddhist and Catholic monastics. The Dalai Lama himself, who Merton had previously met, Dalai Lama traveled to Nelson County for the event, paying respects at Merton's grave. While the monks prayed, other residents focused on commerce. But before the bourbon industry took hold, farmers relied on industrial hemp. The United States Navy needed immense quantities of rope for ship rigging, and cotton planters in the Deep South needed woven bagging to bundle their bales. And if you can imagine, the limestone soil of Nelson County provided perfect conditions to grow the crop. Hemp production required grueling physical effort. Farmers relied entirely on the forced labor of enslaved African Americans to generate their wealth. The institution of slavery defined the local economy back then, and by 1860, the county contained 200 owners holding 925 enslaved people. The outbreak of the Civil War shattered the county. The region became a strategic corridor for Union supply lines. In December of 1862, Union troops fortified a farm near the Rolling Fork River. They fought the Battle of New Haven to defend the railroad approaches from Confederate cavalry. Control of the tracks dictated who could supply the armies moving south into Tennessee. The war also dismantled the institution of slavery in the region, though the process brought immense suffering. Because Kentucky never seceded, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to the state. The only legal pathway to freedom for an enslaved man in Nelson County was to flee as enslaver and travel to Camp Nelson in the neighboring Jessamine County. If a man enlisted in the United States Colored Troops, the Army granted him his freedom and theoretically extended that protection to his wife and children as well. That's a whole other story for another time, because that's not what happened. Following the war, the county faced an economic transition. The loss of slave labor destroyed the hemp industry. Farmers lacked the capital to purchase machinery, forcing the economy to shift towards tenant farming. Residents recognized they needed better infrastructure to survive, and so workers had originally paved the main eastern entry into Bardstown with cobblestones in 1790. Actually, men aged 16 to 50 faced fines if they refused to perform manual labor to maintain the path. The state legislature authorized the Bardstown-Louisville Turnpike Company in 1831. They finished the project in 1838, and they placed heavy stone markers along the route to measure the distance to the Ohio River. The arrival of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad further transformed the county. The tracks reduced reliance on river flatboats and enabled local entrepreneurs to export a new product: bourbon. Distillers realized that local limestone water and abundant corn crops provided the perfect ingredients for whiskey. T.W. Samuels opened a commercial distillery in 1844, signaling an industrial shift. Today, Bardstown operates as the undisputed center of the industry, being known as actually the bourbon capital of the world. Corporations like Heaven Hill, Sazerac, and the Bardstown Bourbon Company operate massive facilities across the county. Beam Suntory recently executed a $400 million expansion at the Booker No distillery, creating dozens of jobs and installing a renewable natural gas facility. The county also successfully courted the automotive industry. Tie Summit, Kentucky operates a metal stamping firm in Bardstown. The corporation recently invested $131 million to expand its footprint to cover 500,000 square feet. Local leadership focuses on infrastructure to support this growth. The county secured a $29 million regional water project scheduled for completion in 2026. Crews lay a 42-inch water main along the interstate corridor to tap directly into the Ohio River. The pipeline will deliver an additional 15 million gallons of water daily to support the distilleries and high-density housing developments. For a place that's as old as Nelson County, residents protect their architectural history through strict zoning laws. The Bardstown Historic District encompasses blocks of commercial and residential structures that illustrate the evolution of the frontier. The old Talbot Tavern opened in 1779. Because workers finished the tavern a full year before pioneers even settled the town of Salem, the structure is actually older than Bardstown itself. According to local tradition, the doors of the business have never closed since that opening year, making it the oldest stagecoach stop in the West that is still in operation. You can eat in rooms where bullet holes mark the walls, damage allegedly caused by the outlaw Jesse James. Not to mention, the place is apparently very haunted. No structure holds more cultural significance, though, than Federal Hill. Judge John Rowan built the 3-story brick mansion. The estate inspired a relative named Stephen Foster to write the song My Old Kentucky Home in 1852. The Commonwealth eventually purchased the property to establish a state park. The age of these buildings generated a tapestry of local ghost stories. During the summer of 1833, a cholera epidemic swept through Bardstown. The disease struck Federal Hill. 8 members of the Rowan family and 8 enslaved individuals died within a single 24-hour period. Local lore claims the spirits of the victims continue to roam the plantation grounds. Paranormal investigators also routinely visit the Jailer's Inn. The building operated as the Nelson County Jail from 1797 until 1987. The modern history of Bardstown is shadowed by a devastating true crime saga that captured international attention, though. In July 2015, a 35-year-old mother of 5 named Crystal Rogers vanished completely. Her car was found abandoned along the Bluegrass Parkway with a flat tire, her keys, purse, and phone still inside. Suspicion immediately fell on her boyfriend, Brooks, who was the last person to see her alive, but the investigation stalled. The tragedy compounded 16 months later. Crystal's father, Tommy Ballard, who had relentlessly led the search for his daughter, was shot and killed by an unknown sniper while hunting on his own property. The FBI eventually took over the case, executing massive searches across local farms and newly built subdivisions. The federal pressure finally broke the case open in 2023 when a grand jury handed down a wave of indictments. In 2025, a jury convicted Brooks and his 2 accomplices, Steve and Joseph, for their roles in the conspiracy, murder, and tampering with evidence. Brooks received a life sentence in prison. And while the convictions brought a long-awaited measure of justice to the Ballard family, no trace of Crystal Rogers has ever been found. That's Nelson County. What'd I get wrong this time?